Hi, I'm Amy Beers, and today's guided tasting is all about the caramel notes. We have Sun King's Wee Mac, which is a Scottish-style ale, and their seasonal Caramel Apple Tripel. And both of these beers exhibit those caramel notes, but they get them in very different ways, which I'll be discussing briefly at the end of this video today on Drinking with Beers. So if you purchase these beers to drink along with me, go ahead and pour yourself a glass and then hit that subscribe button and then let me know what you think about the beer in the comments. So we'll start with the Wee Mac. This is a Scottish style ale and it's one of the OGs of the Sun King Empire. And by empire, I mean on a local level, because Sun King's always been very good about staying true to the craft and brewing beer for the people. So this is the Wee Mac. It is a Scottish style ale. And what I mean is this is an Americanized version of a Scottish ale. This is a malty beer with notes of toffee, chocolate, brown sugar, hazelnut, coffee, and of course, caramel, with just enough hops to balance out that malty sweetness. So if you're wondering what makes it an Americanized version, well, let me tell you. So because America is a melting pot of cultures, and because Europe, both historically and currently, produces a lot of beer, America tends to draw inspiration from those classic European brews. For example, pale ale comes from England. There was a group of American craft brewers at the beginning of the craft beer revolution who studied the English pale ale and then made it their own. So instead of using English hops, which tend to exhibit an earthy flavor and aroma, they used American hops, which exhibits more of a citrus flavor. And that's because American hops were more easily and readily available. So when we see an American version of a European style of beer, typically what you'll get are those American hop characteristics. And then, because as Americans, we tend to value more as being better, generally the American version, by style comparison, will have more hop characteristics, more flavor, and more alcohol. And to truly appreciate the Wee Mac, let's first take a look at what exactly is a Scottish ale. Because of their geographical proximity, Scotland also drew inspiration from those early English pale ales. And just like the later American craft brewers made them their own and adapted them based on ingredients that were readily available. Except the Scottish brewers went the opposite way of the American brewers and brewed beer with less hop characteristics and less alcohol. Another major difference was that Scottish ales tended to be darker in color and also more malty than their English counterparts. This is partly due to Scotland's long history of barley cultivation, mainly for producing Scotch whiskey. And in fact, when Scotland and England were united in 1707, Scotland was exempt from the malt tax, so Scottish brewers were kind of at an advantage to utilize more malts. Now this was originally intended for Scotch whiskey production, but it trickled down to brewing as well. And because of Scotland's climate, hops don't really grow very well there, and acquiring them from places like England was super expensive. So that's another reason why traditional Scottish ales aren't very highly hopped and are more malt focused. So traditional Scottish ale is known for those dark, deep, malty-rich complexities, and especially those caramel notes. And how do you get those caramel notes, you ask? Well, we'll be discussing that in just a minute. So here's a fun little fact that happens to tie in with how Wee Mac got its name. Wee Heavy is a style of beer that originates in Scotland. It's a rich, complex, malty beer, such as you would expect from a Scottish ale, except it has a lot more alcohol, thus why it is called the Heavy. And so, because of its strength, it's served in, or is supposed to be served in, small glassware or wee serving sizes. Wee Heavy literally translates as small strong. So the wee part of the name Wee Mac is obvious at this point. But what about the Mac part? Well, the Wee Mac is actually named partly inspired by Scottish naming conventions, but also it's named after one of the co-owners of Sun King, Clay Robinson's father-in-law. So as I was saying earlier, the Wee Mac is an Americanized Scottish style ale. It has all those rich multi-complexities with those notes of caramel, but then because it's American, it also has those additional flavors like toffee, chocolate, brown sugar, hazelnut, and coffee. Because we like more in America. So go ahead and see which of those flavors you can pick out. Now those brown sugar and coffee notes are going to come out more in the aroma. And when I say coffee, you're not really going to get a roasted coffee. It kind of reminds me more of just walking past a coffee shop and getting a whiff of like a mild coffee. So as I've mentioned in previous videos, everyone's palate is different. You might pick up on some flavors that come through maybe a little bit more prominently than what I'm experiencing. For me, I get more of those toffee and caramel flavors, and some of that hazelnut comes through for me the most. Let me know what you get. As far as the hop characteristics, again, because it's a Scottish style ale, it's not going to be a very heavily hopped beer. However, because it is an Americanized version and we tend to use a little bit more hops, I feel like the Wee Mac compared to a traditional Scottish ale just has a little bit more of those hop characteristics, especially on the back end. I feel like I get that malty sweetness on the front, and then, kind of on the back end, I get a little bit more of that, just a subtle lingering bitterness. And although this is still a beer that is very much malt forward, the hops really prevent this beer from just being too malty sweet. So it really helps balance out those flavors, that sweet versus that bitterness. So the hops used in the Wee Mac are mainly used as bittering agents, but I feel like there is just a very subtle hop characteristic that comes through in the flavors and the aromas. Like I get just a subtle touch of pine and maybe a little bit of spice, but let me know what you think. Just the faintest little touch. Let me know if you pick up on any of that. So here's a fun little tip. One of the reasons I really love the Wee Mac for the fall time is because I love to drink it outside, and here's why. Because I feel like the smell of the autumn leaves falling really complements this beer nicely. And I know that sounds super silly, but no, don't knock it until you try it. Now, traditionally, English and Scottish ales have an earthy quality to them, and that comes from the hops. And this is an American version, so it doesn't have too much of that earthiness, but if you sit outside and drink it, I just really feel like it complements the beer well. Do that though. Do your own experiment at home. Drink this inside and then go outside, especially if it's just rained. I feel like the rain helps bring out those earthy smells, and sip it outside on your patio while the leaves are falling on a beautiful autumn day, and tell me what your experience is. Did you feel like it changed the beer at all drinking it outside? I don't know. Maybe this sounds kind of silly, but just try it. Drink it inside, drink it outside. I feel like this is the beginning of a Dr. Seuss book. So Scottish ales tend to have a lower attenuation level, which means that the yeast have left behind some of those residual sugars, which contributes to the body and the sweetness of the beer. And the Wee Mac does have a little bit of that residual sweetness, but it's not cloyingly sweet. And again, those hops really help balance out that sweetness. So that's the Wee Mac. Let me know what you thought in the comments. And up next is the Caramel Apple Tripel. Are you guys ready for the Caramel Apple Tripel? If you watched my last video, we took a behind the scenes look at how it's made with Andrew over at Sun King. And now we get to taste it. So the Caramel Apple Tripel starts off as a Belgian triple style ale, and then it's aged in Jamaican rum barrels, and then it's put on apples that have been coated in brown sugar and cinnamon and then caramelized. So there's a lot going on with this beer, and I'm gonna break it down for you in just a second. But before we do that, let's just take a moment to really just drink this in. Seriously, one of my favorite fall time beers. It's so good, guys. First, let's talk about Belgian ale. So Belgian ale is all about those yeast characteristics. Now in beer, there are 4 main ingredients in every beer. You have malts, hops, water, and yeast. And between those 4 ingredients will impart different flavors and characteristics to the beer. So you have to have yeast in the beer because the yeast convert the sugars into alcohol and CO2. Otherwise, we would just end up with barley soup. And that's pretty gross. Trust me. So besides turning the sugar into alcohol and CO2, the yeast are also creating these byproducts called phenols and esters that give beer this fruit and spice characteristics. So Belgian yeasts, in my opinion, are the best, and they tend to give off a lot of those fruit and spice characteristics. So the Belgian Tripel is a very fragrant beer with very complex flavors and aromas. Spice characteristics like clove and pepper tend to take center stage, and then you'll also have some moderate fruit characteristics, and then the malt is very pale and soft, which provides a stage for those fruit and spice characteristics to really shine through. And then it's hopped enough just to give it a firm hop bitterness, and there might be a little bit of spiciness from the hops that contribute to that spiciness from the yeasts. And then it's pretty high in alcohol, but because this beer is so well done, it's hard to notice, and so the Belgian Tripel oftentimes will sneak up on you if you're not careful. The best examples of a Belgian Tripel display a harmonious blend between those malts, hops, yeast, and alcohol. So even though it's a pretty complex beer, it still has room for those additional flavors that Sun King decided to add to make it a Caramel Apple Tripel. So the Caramel Apple Tripel does start as a Belgian-style triple ale, and then it's aged in Jamaican rum barrels. And to understand the effects this has on the final beer, let's briefly talk about barrel aging. So as Andrew had mentioned in the previous video how it's made, he said that every barrel has a different story. So when beer is aged in barrels, it will absorb some of the characteristics from that barrel. So it really does depend on the type of barrel it's aged in. So things like the type of wood it's made from or the prior contents will have an influence on the beer flavor. Clean American oak barrels, for example, if nothing has been aged in it previously, if it's a fresh, brand new barrel, the beer will absorb flavors of vanilla and coconut. Beer aged in Jamaican rum barrels will absorb some of that rum flavor as well as any leftover alcohol. The Jamaican rum barrels used to make the Caramel Apple Tripel were American oak barrels. So that's where you are getting the vanilla and the coconut, and then also those toasted sugar flavors from the rum, which I think goes very nicely with the sugar and spice from the caramelized apples. Which brings us to the third layer of this beer. So after it's aged in rum barrels, it's put onto apples that have been coated in brown sugar and cinnamon, and then caramelized with the blowtorch. And that's really what gives this that caramel apple flavor. Okay, so I promised at the beginning of this video that I would explain the difference of where the WMAC and the Caramel Apple Tripel get those caramel flavors. The idea is similar, but it's executed in different ways. Caramelization happens when sugar is heated to 340 degrees Fahrenheit. This breaks down those molecules to form new compounds that give us that deep, rich caramel flavor. It's basically toasted sugar. And it's this caramelization process that gives us those caramel notes in the WMAC and the Caramel Apple Tripel. However, the technique is different. The WMAC is brewed with a portion of caramel malts, and a caramel malt is created differently than regular malted grain. So inside each kernel of barley contains this hard piece of starch that we need to access to be able to convert into sugars, but it's too hard to do anything with. So what happens is we need to take that barley kernel and soak it in water so that it begins to germinate. And as this little tiny baby plant starts to grow within that kernel, it starts to break up that starch and soften it. But we don't want that little tiny baby plant to keep growing because we're not trying to grow a plant, we're trying to make beer. So to prevent that from happening, the barley gets dried and that stops the process. And then it goes into the killing process where it's treated to develop different flavors. And that, in a nutshell, is how you get beer malt. Caramel malt, on the other hand, follows just a slightly different process. So caramel malt still gets steeped and then it begins to germinate. But instead of drying it, it's roasted with its water content still inside. And it's during that heating process that the enzymes start to break down that starch and turn it into liquid sugar. Then it's dried at a high temperature, which caramelizes that liquid sugar inside. And when this caramel malt is added in the brewing process, it's what gives beer that caramel flavor. The Caramel Apple Tripel does use just a dash of caramel malts, but I feel like they did this more as a way to support and enhance those caramel flavors from the caramelized apples, which is really what shines in this beer. The apples already have some natural sugar, and then they're coated in brown sugar, and then they're heated with a blowtorch, which is what caramelizes the sugars. And then because the brown sugar is also caramelizing, you're gonna get those butterscotch notes that you might be experiencing. So that's how the Caramel Apple Tripel gets its caramel flavor. Okay, so we talked about the Belgian triple base. It's been aged in rum barrels, and then it was put on caramelized apples that were coated in brown sugar and cinnamon. So to kind of wrap this up, as far as the flavor profile goes, it's really interesting to me that Sun King used a Belgian triple as the base, because a Belgian triple is already so complex, and then they added even more complexity to it. But it just works. And especially as you let the beer warm up, because oftentimes cool temperatures can restrict some flavors. So as you let the beer warm up, I feel like is when it really becomes magical, because it's like all those different flavors start to get to know each other and become best friends. You definitely get those spice characteristics from it being a Belgian triple, and also because of the cinnamon additions. And then you get that sweetness from the brown sugar and the apple and the caramelization. Also because it's a Belgian triple, you might get a little hint of honey. And then you also might get some pie crust flavors, which would come from the malts. And then of course you get that vanilla and that coconut and those rum flavors from it being aged in the Jamaican rum barrels. And then finally, those notes of butterscotch and caramel from the caramelized apples. So before we go, let's take just one more second to really just enjoy this. You've got to do it with two hands, too. So let me know in the comments what you thought about both the Wheat Mac and the Caramel Apple Tripel. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to be notified of future videos, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I'm Amy Beers. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Drinking with Beers. And until we drink again, cheers.